I remember when I was a child and I used to feel sick, or I'd get injured, or I'd be in some kind of pain. One of the things that my mom would say to me was she was rubbing my back or my head was, if I could take this pain from you, I would. And my mom had an incredible heart, so I believed her most of the time. But I have learned that a lot of what parenting is doing as much as you can to step into the gaps for your children so that they don't have to experience pain or struggle or hurt. I don't always know that this is the best method of parenting, but this is the heart of the parent, is to stay in the way, to hold back suffering or struggle as much as possible. And this could be everything from like standing in line so that they don't have to. It could be running an errand. It could be getting a phone call at 9 in the morning saying, I forgot something at home, and on the one hand thinking, maybe you deserve the consequences of your actions, but then on the other hand, just going home and getting it so that they don't find out what the consequences of those actions are. This is often what parenting is seeing the potential pain and struggle that your children might have and doing everything within your power to try to make sure that they don't experience that sort of pain. Now, in some ways, we could glorify parenting and act as if that's the greatest struggle in the world, that standing in for your kids is about as hard as it gets. But I see other acts of courage and love in our world as well that absolutely amaze me in terms of what people do for other people, especially when pain and illness and disease are involved. When I was pastoring in Maine, my youth pastor, who I adored with all of my heart, had had a heart attack at 30 years old, right after she birthed her first child. So she was a young woman who was facing incredible uphill battles just for her own survival. Now, by the time I had met her, she had already had a heart transplant, and she was told that she was probably someday going to need a kidney transplant as a result of this as well. When she was working as my youth pastor, the day came. Her kidneys were failing. She was going to dialysis on the regular. She was in her mid-30s at this point. She was very, very young. And I would go and sit with her at dialysis at times, and she would tell me about how desperately she needed a kidney transplant and how no one in her family was an exact match for her. And so that put her on this national database where you just kind of weirdly and oddly hoped that someone else might die in a car accident that matches your blood type. That's a weird place to be. Until she found out about this program where if she could find someone in her life that would donate a kidney, not to her, but to someone else, that someone else on the registry might have a match to her, they could trade. And so her dad signed up immediately. Now, if you're a dad or you're a mom, this probably doesn't surprise you at all. But then it became a waiting game to see if there was someone else who could match up. And eventually it came out that there were people who were willing to sign up within our own church to give one of their kidneys to her because they figured they really only needed one after all. Now, can you imagine that? Now, once again, we got to the point that none of them matched. None of them worked. But people were willing to give a kidney to someone else in need. And eventually they did find someone who matched exactly the scenario that she had. So her dad gave up a kidney to be sent across the country to someone in need. And so someone in their family gave up a kidney to come back to Amanda to give her one as well. These sort of acts of love always move me. I always find them so inspiring and almost hard to imagine the willingness to give that much up for someone else. It's easy to find it in parents. Parents will do a lot to stand in for their children. But the fact that there were people, friends, people from across the country, donors who were willing to give the gift of life out of their own abundance was moving to me. And today we're going to talk about love, and we're going to talk about it through the lens of an Old Testament text. We've been working through Isaiah, and we want to look at one last text before Christmas today in the book of Isaiah. And this text is typically called or referred to as the suffering servant. Have any of you heard that term before from the book of Isaiah? Okay, now I appreciate that this is kind of only 50-50 because I like talking about new things. It gets me a little excited. The suffering servant is a text in the latter part of Isaiah that is one of the most crucial Old Testament texts that there is. And one of the reasons that it is so crucial is because it is disputed as to what it means. And this kind of stuff gets me excited as well, because on the one hand, anytime you read the Old Testament, there needs to be a part of our brain that says, this belongs to and means something to Jewish people, okay? We need to be able to read and understand that there is a brother and sister, cousin religion of ours that reads this, that doesn't just plant Jesus on top of it all the time. So, you read latter Isaiah and you have Jewish friends who read this and don't see Jesus Christ at all. In fact, there are scholars among Jews who think that this text might be talking about Jeremiah. It might be talking about Moses. It might be talking about a Messiah who is yet to come, right? There are many Jews who do not believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And so there is something meaningful to Jewish people in this text, even if they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah to come. But it's disputed because we Christians read it and we're like, come on, man, this is Jesus. Look at it. Look at how many things line up. I want to say that we can read this as Christians and say, we believe this is what God has done in Jesus without becoming arrogant about that, right? And so I read this and I see Jesus all over it. But it is because, of course, I put on my Christian lens and I look back through these messianic texts of the Old Testament that are preparing the Jewish people almost in full agreement for a Messiah. The disagreement between Jews and Christians often becomes who the Messiah is and what the Messiah actually does and looks like, right? And so I look back at this text and I feel like I see what Jesus has done all over it. I see this prophetic voice of Isaiah promising a Messiah that will come along and will look like Jesus. And so in this suffering servant text that we're going to read today, the text is up there. It's in Isaiah 52 to 53, if you would like to follow along. You will see, I imagine, as a Christian people, all sorts of overtones of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who comes and lives and dwells amongst us and is crucified and suffers on the cross. And so I want to invite you to hear this with the overtone of Jesus and see particularly the way in which God loves us in our struggle, in our sin, in our not quite togetherness, and to the lengths of which God himself will put himself in harm's way for us, like a parent of a child who may or may not deserve it, but yet the love of God is so overwhelming that God himself will suffer on our behalf, that he might empathize with our suffering and might even take on our suffering so that we don't have to. And so if you would you stand with me as we read Isaiah 52:13 into 53:12. Starting in Isaiah 52, starting with verse 13. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled by him. His appearance was so disfigured, beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouth because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. For by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I imagine in this text, if you know anything about Jesus, you can see the story of Jesus upon this text, that he bears the weights of the sin and the iniquity and the transgression of many, that he goes and he experiences suffering and death and does not protest at all. And because of this willingness to suffer, he takes on the sin and the iniquity and the transgression of the world, and he breaks the power of that over many, and that he will receive a reward for his death. We can see the story of Jesus pretty clearly in this prophetic word of what a Messiah might look like in the book of Isaiah. I want to talk about just how radical the death of this servant is, because I think sometimes we get lost in what words in the Old Testament mean versus just what English translations might mean. There's three words basically for sin, if you will, in this text. And we talk about sin a lot in the Christian church, but I think it's important to recognize just how overwhelming the death of this servant is. First of all, sin, you might know, both the Old Testament and the New Testament word for sin basically just means to miss the mark. It's as simple as that. We can think of sin as really this overwhelming thing, like you've done something really, really terrible. But really, sin, just translated in English, means it misses the mark. You may think of this like if you're into going to the range with a gun or shooting archery, you have a bullseye, you're aiming for the center, you pull your handgun, you pull back the bow, you aim for the center, and you just miss. it's not necessarily the end of the world to miss. But you've missed. You've not done what you intended to do. You've not done what you know is the right thing to do, right? And so that's what sin means, to miss the mark. There's an expectation, there's a call, there's a right way, there's a wrong way, and you have not gotten it right. You can imagine that in that definition, there's a willful act of missing the mark, and there's an accidental act of missing the mark. We can sin on purpose. We can sin without even occurring to us that we have sinned. And we're being told here that Jesus, or that the servant, right, that we read as Jesus, that the servant will take on the sin of both the intentional and the unintentional. That the power of sin, the things we see we do on purpose and the things we don't understand are mistakes that we've made, can be wiped away. And let me show you further, because there's this word iniquity that's used a whole lot here as well. And iniquity isn't so much missing the mark like sin, but iniquity is more like ways in which we distort that which is good. Iniquity means we get an instruction, we hear what we're supposed to do, we begin to rationalize away ways in which we could do it a little different. We kind of talk ourselves, instead of going 100%, we go 90%. Instead of heading in the right direction, we veer just a little bit, and we have a great explanation for why we've done so. Iniquity is the way in which we hear what God says, and we begin to change and give ourselves permission to do things just a little bit differently. This is more of a heart issue than sin is in particular. Sin is, we miss the mark. This is about trying to shift and change things for our own good, even though we may understand it differently. Transgression is another word that's used here, that the servant is crushed for our transgressions. And so there's three different kinds of sin or mistake. And this one is an intentional crossing of a line. This is, I know what is right. I see where the line is. I cannot go over that line and just boldly saying, I am doing what I want to do. And transgression to me kind of feels like the worst of them all. Kind of nasty. Is like when I was in 3rd grade and my teacher told me, you can't talk, you can't cheat, you can't get out of your desk, and I managed to do all three. That's what transgression feels like. I know what the rules are, and I don't care. And we're told in this text that when the servant comes, he will be bruised and crushed, and he will suffer, and he will die, so that all of these kind of sins can be dealt with in our lives. You see, there is not a mistake you have made, accidental or on purpose, that this suffering servant hasn't come to deal with on your behalf. He takes upon his shoulders the worst of who you are and the accidents of who you are. He takes upon your missteps because you're clumsy in life, and he takes upon your disobedience because you are difficult. He takes it all upon himself. He starts piling it upon your shoulders, but not just your sin, not just your iniquity, not just your transgression. Look next to you. You see that clown? He starts piling it on for them too. And then you know that idiot that you work with, that you can't stand? He starts piling it on his shoulders of that person too. And you know that family member that you're not looking forward to sitting at dinner this Wednesday? The one, you know what I'm talking about. Got really quiet in here all of a sudden. No, don't say it. Not him too. No, not him. Please, not him. He starts piling his sin upon his shoulders as well. This suffering servant sees the worst of all of us. And he says, I'm going to come and take upon the burden of all of these folks. Their sin, their iniquity, their transgression. However it is you want to frame the worst of yourself and the worst of your neighbor, this suffering servant piles it and piles it and piles it and takes it all upon himself. And then in order to deal with it, he suffers. He suffers so that we don't have to suffer, so that we don't have to receive exactly what it is we deserve for what we have done and who we have been. This servant comes as the perfect lamb, spotless, so that when he takes on our punishment is erased. So God deals with sin, transgression, and iniquity, and he does so in a manner that is way different than how we like to think of the world. Think of the ways in which this servant is described in this text. All of this is in what we read just today. People are appalled at him. His appearance is disfigured. His form is marred beyond human likeness. There is no beauty. There is no majesty. He's despised. He's rejected. He's familiar with suffering. He's pierced. He's crushed. He's oppressed. He's afflicted. He's led like lamb to a slaughter. He's judged. He's cut off from the land of the living. He is stricken. This is a tragic figure. He shows up with nothing. He suffers, and he is abandoned. And that I read this text through the lens of my Christian faith, and I see Jesus all over this, brings a special meaning to the Christmas that we plan to celebrate this week. That Jesus himself comes to live knowing that this is the call that he takes upon his life. He is not going to come and be born into a hotel. He's not going to be a 5-star guest. He's not going to grow up and live as a model or a movie star. He's not going to be a billionaire or a king. He's not going to be an athlete or the prom king. There is nothing about him that is going to be the sort of life we all aspire to. You see, Jesus, the King of the universe, he's in heaven, and he signs up for just a constant descent from what he deserves and where he belongs to be. One day, he's sitting in the throne room of heaven. The next day, he's gestating in a poor woman's belly. One day, he's the ruler of the universe. The next day, he's squeezing through a birth canal. And when he comes out, when he's born on Christmas morning, he's not born in the finest suite in the corner of the nicest hospital in town. He's placed where cattle feed. Descent, descent, descent. And then when he lives, he doesn't live the most glorious life you can imagine. He heads back to the other side of the tracks. He lives in a skeezy house. He takes up upon a lower form of work in the underclass. He struggles to find food. He takes up itinerant ministry. No one is paying his bills. He works hard, and he can barely find a pillow to lay his head upon. And as he sees the suffering and struggling of people in this world, as he hears about their illness and their pain and their poverty and their hurts and their loss and their grief, he keeps moving towards that instead of shunning the struggles of this world. He takes on the suffering of the world upon himself. It's not just that he takes upon your sin or your iniquity or your transgression. He also sees your suffering, and he pulls that nearby as well. And then he becomes the son of suffering, descending further even to a cross, which we interpret and we call the curse of God. He descends and he descends and he descends until he becomes whipped and beaten and hung and mocked and laughed at, till he begins to suffocate and bleed and then die. The King of heaven, the heir to all creation, descends and descends and descends until we finally pronounce him dead and place him in a tomb. Descend, descend, descend. And somewhere along that descent, somewhere between being the heir of the entire universe and being dead in a tomb, he's crossed over your station in life. He's experienced your struggle. He's had physical ailment. He's grieved death. He's not had enough money for basic necessities. He's had friends turn on him. Somewhere between the descent of heaven and the death in the tomb, he's experienced and seen where you sit right now. And while he didn't sin, while he didn't transgress, he has experienced the temptation that you have to sin and to transgress out of the station of life that you're in. And in his not sinning, he has given to us a pathway towards victory, though it doesn't always feel like victory in the way we have set up our life. But in this descent all the way to the grave, God, of course, lifts Jesus up and resurrects him 3 days later. And in that resurrection, we can see that God can bring victory to whatever struggle or hurt or pain that we have. The good news about a Jesus that comes and dwells with us and suffers alongside of us is that there is a pathway through the struggle and the hurt we have in this moment. Whatever it is that's tempting to us, whatever it is that's hurting us, whatever it is that's bringing us pain or struggle, whatever it is, we can see a victory through the station and place that we are at right now. God has created a pathway to victory for you. And why you? Why us? Why humanity? The answer is just simply that Jesus loves us. He loves you. And the story of Christmas and Easter, the story of Jesus' life is for you. Because Jesus sees you and knows you and has experienced life like you. And he wants to give you victory over the struggle that you're in right now. This is the love of God. God so loves us that he will come and live and dwell amongst us. He will experience the highs and the lows that we have experienced. He is experiencing suffering, pain, loss, grief, brokenness, illness. He's experienced it, and he's taken it upon his shoulders. And when we look upon this love of Jesus, what we're called to do, our response should be to run towards that, to say, I want that sort of love. I've tried love in all of the corners of this world, but I've never received a love that pure before. And that is the love of God, that he will take upon your burden, your sin, your transgression, your iniquity, your grief, your brokenness, your hurt. He takes that all upon his shoulders so that it can be defeated, finally. It's not yet defeated, finally. Part of what Advent is about this waiting between knowing what Jesus has done and awaiting the full redemption of what is to come. We wait patiently for the return of Jesus, where this will be done finally and in full. And that can be a difficult and impatient time. But the day will come where Jesus will return just as he showed up in Mary's belly. And this will be done finally. Jesus will have broken the power of sin and death, and hurt and struggle. But what we're called to in the meantime is to move towards the love of Jesus, to receive Jesus' love for ourselves, that it might transform our own heart, but that also may begin to shape our life as well. that the love and forgiveness and newness that we receive in Jesus can be passed on through us as well, that we might be transformed so that the world might know that it can be transformed as well. Our testimony can be our saying that this story of Jesus is true. And so we love. We are loved so that we can love. But I also want to recognize as we close out today that that itself can be a risk. Love is always a risk, because if you have loved before, I imagine you have experienced loss before as well. And so one of the things I like to do around Christmas time is to take a little bit of stock of the good and the bad. There's so much good in the story of Christmas, that God would come and dwell amongst us. But I also recognize as well that in this season, having received the love of Jesus and passing it on can sometimes be such a risk that we find a pain in that as well. Because I imagine in this room, almost every one of us have something that hurts, that we're wrestling with or we're dealing with as we head into this Christmas season. It could be a death. Maybe you've lost a parent or a child. Maybe you have a dream that just seems completely dead in the water. Maybe you've had a miscarriage. Anytime we try and love, we put ourselves at risk of hurt. And when we have experienced hurt or loss or brokenness or illness, when we've experienced this, it can feel dangerous to try to love again, because what we've experienced is hurt out of that love. And so as we sing this final song today, I want to do what traditionally might be called like a blue Christmas sort of thing. We've experienced all of this joy and gift of love of Jesus, right? And I want you to feel a victory over that, even when this season can feel a little heavy as well. And so I put out on both sides here some blue ornaments, and then we have a white tree on each side, which you can see on the outside of the altars. And as a way of expressing our love, especially in ways that might hurt at this time of year, and we head into the last couple days of Christmas, if you're wrestling with something, I'd invite you as we sing this last song to come and to represent that hurt or that struggle. And even though it's a Christmas tree, even though it's just an ornament, let it be a metaphor of a prayer that you bring to God. Something that you're wrestling with, a loss of a parent, a loss of a friend. I know just this last week, Sharice was telling me, my wife, that she saw 4 people lose someone in their life to death this last week. 4. I mean, right? It could be so heavy at this time of year. And so Jesus takes upon his shoulders our sin, but he also takes upon his shoulders our suffering, our struggle. And there's beauty in seeing that Jesus defeats sin on the cross, but there's also beauty in seeing that Jesus becomes a man of suffering so that he understands our suffering. And so if there is something, again, whatever, loss, diagnosis, it could be an old pain that just lingers. It could be an anticipated pain. It doesn't matter, but use this time to come, grab one of these altars and walk up to the white tree. And I think there's something psychologically powerful about naming something on a tangible object and then letting it go. And that white tree, I don't want you to think that's not God. I know it's not God. But just taking it and letting it go could be like as if you're saying to the man of suffering, the suffering servant, this is my burden. This is my sadness, this is my illness, this is my hurt. And the scripture tells me that you take my suffering on your shoulders. And see what happens when you let it go. And see if Jesus is faithful to his promise that he says, all of your sin, all of your suffering, all of your pain, I'll take it on my shoulders so that the worst of this world can be defeated by what I do on the cross. So as we sing this song, I invite you to stand, and I invite you to come forward, to take one of these ornaments, set it on the tree, and give it to God. and then we'll close the service out together in just a moment.